Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 272 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am the Orange Tank, also known as Neelan. I don't know why I said it like that this week, but there we are. And with me, as always, is the Green Tank, also known as Mark.
Hey!
Just the two of us today, Mark.
Just the two of us, yeah. You know, it's, as of recording, tomorrow is going to be my birthday. And there is nobody that I'd rather spend it with than you and you exclusively without any other tank muddying up the situation. So
I was going to say that this is my gift to you. It's like, one-on-one time with the one and only the me.
There you go. Also known as Neelan.
Yes, also known as Neelan. On today's episode, we are going to be talking storytelling. So this is something that I feel like we've touched on in the past with stuff like theme, but we're going to be specifically talking about the ways that board games are good at telling stories and like what that means in the context of board games versus other mediums. That is going to be in the second half of the episode, but before we get there, let's talk about some of the games that we've been playing recently. And Mark, I believe you've been playing Star Wars: The Clone Wars.
That's correct.
And I'm going to be talking about Artisans of Splendent Vale. So why don't you kick us off, Mark, with Star Wars: The Clone Wars?
So I was in between turns of Agricola and Jump Drive on Board Game Arena, and I was looking for a solo game to play in between those turns. Nothing really jumped out at me. The games that were available for soloing were either too long, or I didn't know the rules. I didn't want to read them all. So I decided, what the heck, I'll play a game that I played a number of times before, that I have the rules down cold for, and that I could play solo. And so I played Pandemic on BGA. This was the first time I played Pandemic in probably 5+ years. And yet, as I expected, the rules came back to me immediately, and I had a much more fun time than I expected. I thought I was burnt out on Pandemic, but playing it again, and maybe the fact that I was playing it solo and was able to play pretty quickly helped, but I really had a good time. So when I was in a local Target, former sponsor of ours, before they cut ties
We're not supposed to talk about them anymore, Mark.
Yeah, right, exactly. No free
check hasn't come through.
That's right. So when I was there and I saw Star Wars: The Clone Wars, a Pandemic system game on the shelf, I decided, what the heck, I'll pick it up. And so now I've played Star Wars: The Clone Wars, a Pandemic system game, a couple of times, both solo and multiplayer. And I've got to say, I think it's pretty interesting. Now, I've played most, if not all, of the Pandemic offshoots. So I've played Pandemic Fall of Rome, Pandemic Iberia, it's called, right? Iberia?
Yes.
Yeah. Pandemic Rising Tide, Pandemic Legacy, of course. I don't think I've played the Cthulhu one, and I have not played the other quote-unquote Pandemic system game, which is a game that came out last year, which I think you played, right? World of Warcraft?
Yes. World of Warcraft, Wrath of the Lich King, bizarrely,
right.
Specifically. But yeah, that one's weird.
Okay, so I haven't played that one, but for the most part, I found myself very much enjoying the other Pandemic, again, quote-unquote, variants that have come out. I can't quite remember how I felt going into those games, but I probably was a little wary that they would be just sort of minor tweaks on the Pandemic system and not really interesting games in and of themselves. But again, I always come out pleasantly surprised by them, and I have to admit that even with all that history of going in apprehensive, coming out happy, I did again go into this game apprehensive, how different is this going to be than regular Pandemic. That being said, I've got to say that this is far and away the least pandemic-y of the Pandemic series of games, at least that I've played, and I think it probably holds up across the entire series. So let's just hop into how the game works and how it is Pandemic-like and how it's not so, as opposed to the other Pandemic games, where you're trying to, in those games, obviously, for the most part, you're trying to contain and eradicate diseases. In Star Wars: The Clone Wars, what you are doing is you're fighting a big bad guy, a central villain. There are 4 that come in the box, and you can choose whoever you want to take on. So you choose one of 4 villains available, at least in the base box. In addition to defeating the boss, you have to accomplish a number of missions, and this is where the difficulty scaling takes place. If you want an easy game, you go with 3 missions. If you want a normal game, 4, and then you can ratchet it up as high as you want by adding these extra missions. And so while you can take on this main boss wherever you want to, they're going to be sort of bouncing around the board, and you can fight them whenever you want to. You only win the game by completing all the missions first and then defeating the main boss. If you defeat the main boss before you complete the missions, then they sort of hop off the board for a while, but then they'll be brought back on later, and I'll explain that more a little bit further down. So in terms of what you're actually doing, this is probably where the biggest departure from Pandemic is. So in this game, you're going to have a number of cards. However, these cards are, first of all, played open to the table. So you're just laying them out in sort of a personal tableau, as opposed to standard Pandemic where you're having a hand of cards, like a standard hand of cards, which you're managing. Also in Pandemic, Star Wars, the Clone Wars, whatever it is, you're not discarding the cards for the most part. Whenever you want to use a card in this game for an action, or more accurately to enhance an action, and again, more about that later, what you're doing, instead of discarding them, you're going to instead tap them. And then at the beginning of subsequent turns, the first thing you're going to do is refresh all your tap cards. So instead of expending cards, you're basically just tapping them, and then on your next turn, you'll start to turn off by refreshing them all and getting them all back. So on your turn, you basically, again, like standard Pandemic, have 4 action points, and you can do one of a couple of different things with those action points. You can travel, which is basically going from one planet to the next, like a standard move action. And here's the first place where you can use those cards. So one of the types of cards that you're going to have, and there are 4 types in the game, one of them will basically, you can tap them to buff up or increase your movement action, so that will allow you now to move double the number of spaces you normally do. So instead of moving 1 space, you can tap one of these movement cards in your tableau and you will move 2 spaces. And another thing that will be a theme throughout the uses of cards in this game, if you have a teammate on the same planet you're on, when you take the move action, they can tap one of their move cards, and then you can still move 2 spaces. And that's going to be a theme in the entirety of the game. Whenever you are on a location with a teammate, whatever action the active player is doing, any teammate on the planet can tap that type of card to buff up the active player's action. So sort of the team part of Pandemic sort of shining through there. Another thing you can do on your turn is to fight enemies. So enemies come in basically 3 forms. I've already mentioned the main boss, who may or may not be on the board. But what is the most akin to the disease cubes in standard Pandemic are these little droid figures that are going to be all around the board, and sort of, again, are the most akin to the disease cubes. There's the droid figures, they're the main boss, and then finally the third type of figure are these blockade figures, which I'm going to touch more upon a little bit later. Whenever you take a combat action, what you're going to do is you're going to roll a die, and it's going to have a number of successes and basically failures on the die face. And the successes and failures can both be on the same die face. So you might roll a die and get 2 successes and 1 failure or whatever. It can be some combination of the two. And however many successes you get are the number of like damage points you can inflict on enemies. And again, one of the types of card, actually 2 of the types of cards that you have buff up the attack. So you roll a die, say you roll 2 hits, then you can tap either these attack cards or these stealth cards, which are basically 2 suits of cards that buff up your attack strength. They're basically identical, but they come in 2 different colors. Again, like attack is red, I think, and stealth is purple. And the one thing is you can spend as many cards as you want, but they all have to be the same suit. So if I want to attack an enemy and I want to buff it up at like 3 points, I would tap 3 either stealth cards in purple or attack cards in red. And just the only thing is you can't cross. You can't do 2 attack and 1 stealth or whatever. So you get a number of attack points, and then you assign damage to the enemies. Droids are 1 point of damage, blockades are 2, and then the villain, the main bad guy, is going to have a number of points equal to whatever their specific strength is, which is on a card on the side of the board. And then you'll just remove the enemies you damage. And then after you've assigned the damage to the enemies, you get damage yourself, and that is where the failures on that roll are. So, you roll the die has 2 successes, 1 failure. That 1 failure is the damage you're taking, and the way the damage is afflicted upon you is that you have to discard cards from your tableau for the number of damage you take. So if you take 3 points of damage, that tableau that you're using to buff yourself up, you are going to discard 3 cards. One of the types of cards you can use, again, there are 4 types of cards. There's the 1 movement buff, there are 2 attacking buff, and the final card is like an armor. So you can tap that card to reduce the damage you take. Sort of interestingly, if you're out of cards and you take damage, basically nothing special happens. You're basically just in a weakened state because you have no cards in your tableau, but it's not like it advances the loss condition, which I thought was sort of interesting. Another action you can do is, and this is sort of, again, another departure from general Pandemic, is that you can take an action to draw a card. Whereas in standard Pandemic, every turn you're drawing cards. Here, if you want to draw cards, it is a separate action. And finally, another action you can do, and one of the big things that you need to do are to accomplish missions. And again, you accomplish missions first. Once you get them all cleared, you fight the big bad. The way that you accomplish missions sort of varies from mission to mission. There are going to be these cards that you have in like a little special missions deck that will be revealed throughout the course of the game. But basically what most of them come down to is they have a location and then a victory condition, which is basically usually a number that you're trying to hit. And so you travel to the planet where the mission is, and then you, again, roll this combat die, and it'll have a number of successes. You subtract that number from the target number, and then you supplement that with the type of card that the mission is asking for. So a mission might ask for armor cards and stealth cards, and the number might be 6, for example. You go to that planet, you roll the die, say it has 2 successes. Now your success number went from 6 to 4, and then you have to tap a number of cards that are, in this case, armor and stealth cards to get it down to 0, and then you've accomplished the mission. Again, if you have teammates on that planet, they can tap cards too. And there's also some variants with the missions. They're not all just like get to a mission and hit a number. There are some that like you have to go from one planet to another. There are some that are going to give you what are called ally cards, which are akin to the event cards in Pandemic. So, there are cards where if you complete the mission, you get an ally that goes in Tableau, and then you can use the ally like an event card, sort of discard it for a one-time power. And so that's what you're trying to do. In your way are a couple of things. So first, and this is a very pandemic-y side of it, is there are a deck of cards that represent the different planets in the galaxy. And like regular Pandemic, what you're going to do on your turn is you're going to draw a number of cards based on what's called the invasion track, which is sort of like the infection rate track in standard Pandemic. And you're going to flip the cards over as you would in Pandemic, and you're going to place droids in those planets the same way you do like infection cubes in general Pandemic. But here, when you have to place the 4th droid, instead of like having it spread like regular Pandemic, you're going to place that other figure I mentioned, the blockade figure. Whenever you place a blockade figure, it gets in the way because it costs 2 combat points to defeat, but also this is the game trigger. There's a threat track, which whenever you place a blockade figure on the board, the threat track moves up. If the threat track hits the end of the track, you lose, which is, again, another interesting point in the difference between this game and regular Pandemic. There is only one win condition. There is only one loss condition. Okay. The only win condition is if you defeat all the missions, defeat the boss. The only loss condition is this threat track. Now, again, adding these blockade figures move up the threat track, but also every turn, one of the things you're going to do is you're going to flip the special deck that each boss has. So each of the 4 bosses has their own 6-card deck, and each boss will function differently and do different things. Some are more like buffing things up. Some of them will go around and sort of mess with your missions that you're trying to accomplish. The main boss, I think Count Dooku, implements all the other bosses. He's like the most difficult one because he brings in all the other bosses to fight. So they all play different, but some of their cards will advance that threat deck, which again is a loss condition. Also, every boss, one of their 6 cards is going to be akin to, I think it was called the Epidemic card in Standard Pandemic, right, which does the same thing as Standard Pandemic does, which is like you draw a new card out, you place 3 droids on that one, you shuffle up all the cards that have been in the discard deck, you put them on top of the stack, so the most vulnerable planets are now even more vulnerable because they're going to come out. So that's a very Pandemic-y thing.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because throughout this whole explanation, I was wondering whether that was going to show up, which to me is kind of the core of Pandemic, right? Which is the epidemic and like, oh no, everything that has been recently infected is now in danger of being infected again. And like, I kept wondering, like, wait, does this not even have what I would consider like the archetypical system?
Right, yeah. And so there are definitely
so just to clarify, it moves that to the villain deck.
Yes, it moves the epidemic card to the villain deck. And I guess, I forget how frequently, I guess in Standard Pandemic, there was some variance in how frequently it came up. With the villain deck, it's going to come up one every 6 times, give or take, because you're shuffling the deck. But yeah, it's generally has that same pacing as well.
Yeah, okay.
And so that's the game. I liked it. I appreciate having a game that I can both play solo, because as listeners might know, I'm starting to appreciate solo games more. So it's nice to have one that is on the simpler side, so I can just sort of break it out and play it without having to refresh myself on a ton of rules. And because I've played so many games of vanilla Pandemic and the Pandemic offshoots, even though this one is a departure, it's enough of Pandemic so that getting up to speed isn't difficult. I also like how different it is from Standard Pandemic, and in a lot of ways, there was enough novelty there that it felt fresh. That's not to say that the other games in the Pandemic line felt like slight deviations to Standard Pandemic, but this, again, is the biggest departure I think that I've ever played, so it's nice that it gives it that level of novelty, I think. That said, I didn't necessarily love it. I mean, it's a fine solo game and a totally fine co-op that I've enjoyed playing co-op as well. It's just that even though this is, again, the least pandemic-y of the games, there's still enough Pandemic in there where I sort of know it and I sort of felt satisfied after a play or two. I didn't feel like the need, like, oh, this is a whole new world, I got to play this a ton of times. I'd be happy to revisit it. I think it's a great introduction to co-op games for those who maybe aren't really into hobby games, but maybe are into Star Wars, because it's, as with other Pandemic games, relatively easy to teach. I don't think the changes to the Pandemic system are necessarily that much more complicated. It's not like these changes mean a more difficult version of Pandemic. And you do have that co-op thing where everybody at the table has a common goal, so it's fun, where you get that feeling like we're all in it together. So I'd say that if you're a huge fan of Star Wars, and I've heard that this adaptation sort of is pretty faithful to the Clone Wars history. I wasn't personally familiar with it, but I've heard it's good if you're a fan of that.
I mean, it's probably one of the more popular offshoots, I guess, quote unquote, of Star Wars at this point.
The animated series was pretty popular. So yeah, there's obviously an audience for it outside of just the general Star Wars audience. So if you're a fan of that, I'd say go for it. If you're a fan of that and like co-ops, then certainly go for it. If you have people in your life who, you know, again, dabble in these hobby games, but maybe aren't super into it, feels like a good one to do, especially if they're fans of Star Wars, because again, the co-op nature makes it an easy sell, I think. So yeah, I enjoyed it. Didn't love it, but I think there's definitely an audience for it. So yeah, that is Star Wars: The Clone Wars, a Pandemic system game. And this is by Alexander Ortloff and Z-Man Games.
So interestingly, I noticed that designer is one of the sort of the 4 offshoot designers that created World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King, the previous, the other Pandemic game I had played. One thing I was curious, because this actually does seem, based on your description, to share a lot of DNA with that game in particular.
Okay.
Even though that game was maybe slightly closer to the Pandemic model, it kind of feels like this is more of a divergence in that branch, as it were. So that's interesting. The biggest problem I had with Lich King was kind of just the difficulty felt much lower than regular Pandemic. Did you have that issue at all with this?
Yeah, so this is really made to tailor to your level of difficulty that you want. So they have like the 3 missions, which is like the easy mode. The standard mode is 4 missions, but you can, you know, go up to, I think 6 is like very hard, and then anything more than that is, you know, impossible or whatever. So it's really meant to tailor, which I don't necessarily love, because I like to know like what is the difficulty.
Yeah.
But generally with these type of games, whenever I play like a solo game, I'll play the first time standard, and I found that to be fairly simple. Yeah. And now I think just going forward, I'll always play like on the max difficulty.
It is interesting, because I do wonder, because I remember, and again, this was when I was newer to the hobby, but I remember the standard difficulty of Pandemic being challenging.
Yes,
right?
For sure.
And the idea that now you will always kind of almost
need to
expected to beat it out of the box in standard difficulty, like, feels like a step backwards to me. Like, it should be challenging at the outset.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you know, whenever I beat a co-op game the first time, like, that's a real knock on it.
Yeah.
Like, even if it does offer like a difficulty throttling where you can move it up or down, I really hate beating a co-op game the first time.
Absolutely. I'm less likely to come back on a higher difficulty. Like,
exactly.
Even 100%. Though that option exists. Yeah. Well, interesting. So I am going to be talking about Artisans of Splendent Vale. This is designed by Nikki Valens. This was a Kickstarter that has now since been fulfilled and is now readily available at retail at this point. This was a review copy sent to us by Renegade. The only game of Nikki Valence's that I'm familiar with is Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition, although I know that their game Legacy of Dragonholt has also gotten a lot of praise, in particular for its storytelling. So you can maybe start to see where the inspirations for this episode come from, because, not to bury the lead, I think the way that Artisans of Splendent Vale handles storytelling is excellent. So, at its core, what this is a game that's sort of in the wake of stuff like Gloomhaven, where you are assembling a party of characters and going out to explore a map of the world in a sort of a scenario-based fashion. So the main difference, the biggest divergence in the structure of the game, is that a large proportion of it, the majority of it, in fact, it takes place through these storytelling books. There are 4 characters out of the box, and each of them comes with this lovely, lush, thick paperback book that is effectively like a choose-your-own-adventure book. But I can't stress that these are lovely, chunky books. Once you've assembled your party, so in my case, I'm playing this with a friend, once we have our 2 characters, we then start a scenario by both turning to a paragraph in that book together in our collective books. So I have my book, she has her book, and we read our paragraph together. So you tend to like alternate. So like, let's say I might be reading through this chunk of story to start with. Now, the thing that's really clever about this is at regular intervals, you might just see the icon of one of the other characters in the game, indicating that if that character is in your party, they have some observations or choices or information about this part of the story. And the way that the game utilizes this throughout is really, really, really novel. Whether that's just a party member finding something like an item just because they have a specific expertise. Like one of the characters is more of an expert in, say, tech versus plant life, or alchemy. So there's this idea that as you're exploring the world, that you're going to get these interjections by characters that know a lot more and can expand on the lore and just add a little bit of their flavor and characterization to the storytelling that's happening at that point. You're making choices, exploring maps, which will all show up at various intervals in these books. And there's another little fun interjection there where you're sort of doing that sort of thing you see in a lot of this style of game where you're hunting for numbers that are on the map to indicate places that you can explore. So this is something we kind of saw in Seventh Constant, for example. And the ones that are more obvious are more visible, but the ones that are kind of like hidden away might have like interesting little secrets stuck behind them. But the maps are different based on the book. So I might have a number on my map that's something specific that my character might notice. So we're kind of both looking at these maps together and be like, oh, I see something over here. And then we turn to that paragraph. That paragraph doesn't even exist in the other player's book. It's only just for me to turn to explore and discover what's going on there. And this could be very cursory. This could be just very surface level. But the way that it injects flavor is so neat. I don't want to spoil too much about this, but there's one specific encounter that I just thought was so lovely, which is at some point my character is revealed to have like arachnophobia. Okay. So there's this one section where we're exploring one corner of the room and we both discover there's spider webs across the entire room. And instantly my paragraph reads, Harvey goes into the room, sees the spider webs, is like, no. And there's like instructions that says, close your book. And I just like, close my book and I'm out of it. And that leaves my friend to explore that entire section on their own. At regular intervals, she's allowed to like invite me over to help out, but it's just repeated, no, absolutely not, close your book.
Interesting.
So like there's just like fun little injections of flavor there. And that this builds to something where at some point I'm allowed to like test to overcome my fear, to like help out with the situation. And the thing that gets me interested in is like how many little things there are for the characters we're not playing, for example. I've seen a lot of people say that this is best played as a 4-player game because you get the perspectives from each of those characters, but it's even thought of the ways that make that an interesting decision on its own, whereas the other characters that aren't in your party just sort of exist at the town and can be interacted with if you're not playing with them. So I don't think that this works badly at all, even at 2 players. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Like, in fact, it gets my head spinning about what the possibilities are with the characters we're not playing with. So once you get through these major chunks of the story, which again are largely choose your own adventures, there are regular style scenarios that are very much akin to like a Gloomhaven. But I think to the game's credit, it doesn't make these very, very lengthy. They're actually quite simple, maybe too simple, but they're lovingly illustrated in the way that Jaws of the Lion does it, where you just have this giant map book, you open up to a section, you have a new bespoke map for this scenario. It always comes in at sort of a indeterminate part in the story, so it's not always strictly at the beginning or at the middle at the end. There's kind of like this build up to where the tension and the combat sort of suddenly shows up, and then you're kind of working through a similar system of taking actions, defeating monsters until all of them are defeated or some other goal is completed. It also plays with kind of the legacy format in a lot of really fun ways through the use of stickers, cards that you're collecting. In fact, other than this map book and these choose your own adventure books, the only other component, I'm going to call it, is this massive deck of index cards, which is largely a lot of like equipment you're getting, stickers that you're just putting straight onto your character sheet to indicate like new equipment, new abilities, new upgrades. Injuries that your character has are represented by stickers that you just put on their character portrait so that you're modifying their appearance. Equipment is a sticker that you'll put on your characters, like give them like a new pauldron or a new shoulder piece or something. It's just a lovely piece of production. Like it's so visual and it's just so colorful and it's just so adorable. It really, really is. It's got such a family-friendly vibe that I just found so charming. And then you layer on top of that the fact that this is designed by a very diverse group of designers, where they are creating characters that are both queer and diverse in ways that you just don't see in games very often. It's just really neat. It's something that's quite special.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the production. It is quite lavish and very, very like colorful and very, very inviting. Were you familiar with another of Nikki Valens' games, Legacy of Dragonholt?
I've only heard of it through So Very Wrong About Games,
yeah,
right, who have similarly like raved about the storytelling and in particular. So
right.
I am now like more intrigued than ever to like, after I'm been done with Splendent Vale, to go pick that up, because again, there is something that's like so, well, I will maybe like come back to this later in the episode, but there's just something so dynamic about the way this does story, where it doesn't just feel like, I mean, you know, I say this while it is literally a lot of just reading chunks of text, but there is something that just feels like you're so invested in the choices you're making, right, where they feel meaningful and they feel interesting, and the way that it interjects like cool moments and cool events, just I've never seen before in a game.
And you were saying when you finish with this one, you might be going back to Legacy of Dragonholt. What big of a game is this in terms of the legacy aspect of it? How far along are you?
So I have heard 30 to 40 hours, I think is the number that I've seen thrown around. Playing a day of it probably takes like maybe an hour or two. Okay. So, you know, a session you're probably getting through like, you know, maybe 2 days is typically how the pace that we've gone at. So I would say that, you know, we're expecting to maybe take like a few more weeks with this. But yeah, it's quite sizable, but it doesn't feel like... There are times in a lot of campaign games where you're kind of just playing them to get through them, right?
Right.
I feel like quite invested in seeing where this is going and seeing where this is going to throw us. Not because like I think necessarily the arc of the narrative is fantastic, but because the little ways it does characterization are so like exciting and interesting to me.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, it does look very interesting. Like even the way that each character has their own book, and the way you were saying like you apply stickers to represent damage or to represent new weapons. It does feel like very interesting, very novel, very like unique. And again, the color scheme and like all these pastels and stuff and the wonderful art make it all like, again, very, very inviting.
Inviting is exactly the right word, because it's like even when you just open up the box and you just see like the way that they've laid out the box, it's a pretty egregious use of space in terms of like empty air, but like it's just like these 4 paperbacks, like slam dunk in the middle, spine upwards, and then off the side the boxes of the characters. It's just very like lush in a way that I think is quite lovely. So yeah, that is Artisans of Splendent Vale by Renegade Games and Nikki Valens. So before we get on to the feature topic, we just wanted to call out our Patreon, which you can visit by going to patreon.com/boardgamebarrage or boardgamebarrage.com/patreon. We thought of
we make it very, very easy for people to give us their money.
Exactly. If you're not familiar, the Patreon is just one of the ways that you can support the show. There are a number of membership tiers, and at each tier you get differing rewards, and those are most frequently, even at the lowest tier, just little bonus podcast episodes. So we record an off the record every week, which sort of goes on to the end of the show. It's literally us folding on from saying goodbye to going straight into the off the record. So it's our closing thoughts and thoughts we had going into the episode. We also have once a month a bonus episode, which is more geared towards other stuff we've been doing outside of board games. So we talk about like a lot of the shows we've been watching, books we've been reading, or just other stuff going on in our lives. And then finally, if you're a member of our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, there are Discord rewards available. So you can check all of that out at boardgamebarrage.com/Patreon.
I will say that our highest tier is not available, though, because there is only one true and living fan, and that is Leland, who has taken that tier for a while now. So Leland is our one true and living fan, and not to be supplanted.
We owe him a game of Thrones, Mark.
We are, yes. I'm very eager to do that. He couldn't make it to Dice Tower West, unfortunately, but we have to get that going.
Yeah.
My last play of Game of Thrones was a while ago.
Gosh, I haven't played it in like 12 years.
Yeah, I think, God, when would it have been? It would have been probably about 5 years ago, but it almost ended in a breakup, which the breakup ended up happening like a year later. So it was the beginning. It was the first crack in that relationship. But yeah, hopefully the same thing doesn't happen during our game of Thrones, but I'm excited to play it.
Yeah, same. I've already played like a couple of times, and again, a very long time ago, but I remember loving it.
And I haven't played with the expansions, which I heard some of them are quite good. So yeah, Leland, let's get that game going.
Okay, let's get into our feature topic, which, as I sort of teased earlier, was about storytelling. And for my purposes, this was definitely a sort of a very selfish topic where it's very heavily inspired by some of the stuff I was talking about in Artisans of Splendent Vale. And the reason very specifically is kind of for all of the stuff that I've kind of alluded to already, which is that I think that the way that Artisans of Splendent Vale does storytelling was actually very, maybe inspiring is maybe the word. Like I kind of came away thinking like, man, this is really an experience that I have seen attempted in other games. Like doing choose your own adventure as your style of storytelling is not novel in and of itself, but the things that Artisans does with the format and what it does with characterization specifically. Like if you're playing Gloomhaven or Frosthaven or what have you, your characters are not really agents in the storytelling. They're almost like passive observers to the storytelling. But Artisans kind of makes your characters very much the fabric of the story that's being told, if not the most important part, in a way that I thought was just really, really cool.
So I was going to sort of ask you about that because, like you, I've played a number of games that have either a sort of like a paragraph reading, sort of choose your adventure thing, or a storytelling component, and it's never really worked for me. I've gotten to the point where I think it's just a thing that I am not interested in. One of the problems I had with Gloomhaven, one of the things that didn't make it stick for me, is that I never really got engaged in the story. And I've heard mostly positive things about the Gloomhaven story, but to hear you sort of say that Artisans of Splendent Vale is doing something wholly different in the way that your characters are more active in the story, you're saying, as opposed to like Gloomhaven where they're passive, makes me wonder if there is a chance that I will be into something like Splendent Vale. Because to be frank, like as fantastic as your review was of the game in the first half of the episode, when I'm hearing you talk about it and hearing you talk about reading, paragraphs and even doing it as a communal thing where you're reading a paragraph and your partner is, and there's this dynamic part where you're closing the book when you're running across the spiders. For as cool as that did sound cool. Like I still have that concern in my head, like it's going to feel to me like I'm not going to get engaged, and it's going to end up feeling like paragraph, and that's always my concern when I hear a game has like a heavy narrative component to it.
I totally get that, because I've got to be honest, like even in the context of Artisan, and just for some context here, I grew up loving a lot of choose your own adventure style things, game books, like fighting fantasy and stuff like that. Like the stuff that was in the vogue when I was young. I love that stuff.
What is fighting fantasy? I feel like you've brought this up before.
So, funnily enough, I don't know why fighting fantasy is the first thing that came to mind, because it's actually not one that I had played, but they're kind of like role-playing games in a book, where it's kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure interspersed with, hey, you're fighting a thing now. So roll combat, but you're moving around a map, making choices, having an inventory in some of the more elaborate ones. So they're kind of replicating what kind of video, well, I mean, they're not replicating because they were doing it earlier, but similar to what video role-playing games do, just as best as you can model through a book. It's very much the same model, that stuff that Gloomhaven like takes and just expands in like the most elaborate way possible. So I definitely was never going to come into something like Artisans and be like, oh yeah, this is not for me. But I did struggle to think of someone who would be the appropriate person to play this with. I would never have broached like you or Callan or Christina to play this, because it is just a lot of us reading to each other. Like, to be quite honest, even a lot of my regular game group, I don't know that I can think of the right people I would play this with. I just sort of lucked into sort of reestablishing a friendship with someone that was just like, hey, this would be the perfect game for the two of us to play. And we both ended up loving it. But I think it's so specific, to be perfectly honest. Like, I mean, it's expensive, so I wouldn't say like, oh yeah, you should definitely just go out and get this and try it. But it's one of those things where it's like, if you, I think, have more of an affinity for that style of storytelling, if you're not the sort of person that's put off by large chunks of text when you read them inside these storytelling games, then, I mean, it's worth looking into at the very least.
So you mentioned that this isn't a type of game that you would necessarily like rush out and suggest that Kellen or I or Christina play. Speaking of Christina, do you think, because I feel like Christina, as probably our most like literate, our most well-read of the tanks, I feel like if a game had enough of a hook or had enough quality in writing that it might push her over the edge, you still don't think that this game would reach that for her? Or you think the lack of game might?
I think it could. If anything, of the three of you, I would say Christina would probably be the most, because I'm thinking back to like our experience with The King's Dilemma, where I feel like Christina and I gravitated towards the most because we were invested in the story and like where it was going. I think that there is just... It's that if you're hungry for a story being told, no matter what the medium is, you know, then I think it will work in that sense. And now the thing I do want to kind of wrap around to, and not to talk about Artisans exclusively, is kind of exactly that, though. Is like, I do think that what I'm interested in talking about is this idea that it's not just about a well-told story, if that makes sense, so much as like how you marry that to the game that you're playing. Because I think what's interesting about the idea of storytelling in any medium is like how effectively it uses that medium, right? And this is something that kind of video games like struggled with for a very long time, because video games had this, and you know, some of the best video games I know are still just largely told through reams of text. But one of the things I think that happened in the last 10 years especially is this way of using the medium of games to effectively tell stories. And it's something that happened a lot in the indie scene, especially, where you're kind of using the mechanics to effectively convey like either a struggle or something like that. And it's a thing that I think can sometimes be effectively conveyed through like solo games, which is where the mechanics of the game are kind of trying to get you to feel like either like under pressure or tense or something like that. You know, it's something that, like, for example, just coincidentally, like Pandemic does really well. Like, where the mechanics of the game constantly create like a tension, a pressure that you kind of feel rising. And every time you get to that like epidemic card, you get the sense of dread because you know what's coming. And that, you know, that in itself is a form of storytelling. Even if it's not like a narrative, it's something that a game's mechanics can sort of convey effectively through the specific medium itself.
Right. And I've got to say, like, I've obviously played a ton of games, and I don't think I've ever really been hooked into a story in any game where it came down to, like, reading text. Again, Gloomhaven, that was one of the things that sort of threw me off of it. I guess, like, Mansions of Madness, I had a little bit more connection with that one. Because the story was sort of being told to us, and I feel like when you're reading text, there's sort of like a concern, at least that I have, like, am I reading this to the group in a way that is engaging? Like, I make sure to, like, but when it's being read to you in the app in Mansions of Madness, there is like a, hey, we're sort of at the movies quality to it that sort of helps a little bit. And I think Mansions of Madness is a good game for putting you in interesting situations so that even gets you engaged even more. But I think that when you're talking about games where I did feel a story or I did feel a connection to the actual game itself, and I'll be frank that I don't know if I think like games are great conduits of storytelling, but a couple of games that jump to mind, I'll use the lesser example first. And this is sort of like a random example, but like games like Eldritch Horror, which is a game that I don't really like, but games of this ilk, games like Dead of Winter. And what I like about those games in terms of storytelling is, yeah, they have bits of story, but that's not what I like. What I like about those games are the fact that your character like has like a job and a name. And so even if the job has nothing to do with like the game itself, like, you know, you have a character who's a cook, you sort of have this like story going on in your head. Like, why did the cook get involved? Right. Or this person's like a swashbuckling detective. I like games where that is sort of unsaid. There's like usually a little blurb. I usually don't even read that blurb. I just go with like the character art, the name, and things like nationality and job. Like that's always like, he's the French cook, or he's like the writer or whatever. It's like a backstory that built up in my mind. And that is always so much nicer to me than just character art or just like a class, like warrior or archer or whatever. There was a game, I can't remember what it was, but it was a war game. I was talking about it when Big News was on the show. But it's a game where you have a squadron of planes, a solo game I played earlier. And just one little touch is like each of the planes has its own name and I think the pilot's name. And just that, you just feel a connection. I don't want to know the backstory. I don't want to read like a whole paragraph of text about them. Although I wouldn't mind it because I do like historical flavor text and you know, there's a place for it. But in terms of like a narrative, I just like that little touch, that little thing that lets you build a story in your head.
So I have a little anecdote about this now. I'll bring it back to board games in a second because it's very relevant to what you're talking about, which is one of my favorite examples of video game storytelling is not narrative at all, which is the XCOM video games, where all you get in XCOM is a squad of random Marines who are going out fighting aliens, but each of them has a randomized look and a randomized name. And with that, you can do so much just in and of yourself, you know, because like, for example, like I have this core memory of like a game of XCOM when I was like 11 years old of two characters who happen to have the same surname. Complete just glitch, not glitch, but random, you know, function of the thing. But in my head, this one was the daughter of the previous one, right?
Right.
And then the father dies, and now Astrid Alcaviades has to sort of live on to avenge her dad. And like that story exists entirely inside my own head, but it's something that sort of like generative emergent properties can add when the game gives you enough of the materials to work with. Interestingly, like, I don't know if you know this, but like Eldritch is also designed by Nikki Valance,
right?
Partially. So like part of that generative property of just characterization that you're describing sounds like it's baked into their designs, like to a large extent.
Absolutely.
Which is really, really cool to see. This is also something that Undaunted does, for what it's worth. Like every card, every soldier has a name, it has a unique piece of art on it. And like it's a small touch because there's no flavor text, there's no, like you say, there's no background blurb. But every time one of your characters dies, when a troop dies in Undaunted, it's typically not coming back. It's not that sort of deck builder. So you take it out of your deck and you're like, oh, I've lost Caleb Brown and like I will never see him ever again.
Right.
And there's something to that, you know?
That does a lot, yeah. The other game that sprang to mind when we were talking about storytelling has really no storytelling aspects to it at all, but just in the subject matter and like the solemnity in which it deals with it has always struck me, and that is Freedom, the Underground Railroad.
Right.
Which 100%. Is a game
100%.
about trying to ferry slaves from the South up to Canada to have them escape. And it's a sort of pandemic-like in that it's a co-op and you're trying to move these slaves who are represented as cubes. And you sort of think as you're being taught the game or as you're learning the game, like, okay, I'm moving these cubes up to Canada. And you have to sort of evade these like slave catchers who are moving around the board as well. But I'll tell you, like every time a slave catcher goes and gets one of your cubes and you move it to like, there's like a little part of the board where you put the caught cubes, you put them in that, and you imagine it's a slave that was just trying to seek their freedom and now it's been caught. It's really, really affecting. And there are times in the game where, like you would in Pandemic, where you have the choice where it's like a lesser two evils, like, okay, I can move this cube and sort of sacrifice this one cube, but it's going to help these other cubes, you know, get to the win condition. But when you're doing that in Freedom, the Underground Railroad, and the one cube that you're sort of sacrificing, that you're sort of like allowing the catchers to take, is like a person, is like a human in this like abstracted way. Again, it's just very affecting, and it does a ton for the narrative, for like my appreciation for that aspect of the game without, you know, having any like real text. There's some flavor text in some of the cards that you're playing and you're using, but just very effective in that aspect.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I think the thing that is kind of interesting to me about this topic is I actually kind of largely agree with, I think, your position, which is that I think for the most part, board games don't do storytelling very well. And largely because they don't attempt to. And, you know, that's fine. That's one thing. But even when they do attempt to, I think they fall into the most basic form of that sort of storytelling, which is, okay, let's treat this like a book. Everyone is gathered around the table. All they want to do is read this book together. It's like, no, that's not true unless you do that particularly well, which is like how Artisans does it. And then I think with the games that's really start to lead into, you know, what does it mean to be at this table manipulating these components, and how can you even inject emotion or narrative or some touch of like dynamism into what is just like an otherwise mechanical process? And I think that is so interesting to me. Like that's the sort of thing that I find fascinating. I've not played it yet, so you take with a grain of salt, but I've heard that like This War of Mine, for example, like trades in that a lot. And, you know, if it's anything close to the video game that it's based on, I absolutely believe it, because that takes, you know, what could otherwise be abstract characters and turns them into tiny micro stories that you get very heavily invested in, like over the course of playing.
Yeah, I've heard that same thing about This War of Mine, and I have it, but one of the reasons that I haven't dived into it is I just am worried that it's going to be based on a bunch of reading, and I'm worried that I'm not going to get hooked into it, and so that's been my concern. But I've heard nothing but great things about it.
Yeah, it's definitely on like my short list of stuff that I need to play at some point. I think solo games can sometimes be better for this, because one of the things that's hard with, I would say, storytelling to a group is kind of, I think, the thing you described in Mansions of Madness, which is unless you have a single narrator, you're not all getting the same experience, and largely it's contingent on the way that one person is telling that story to the group, which can be a problem because, you know, you either have someone that's good at storytelling, which is kind of the heart of what like the tabletop role-playing movement is, which is to say, hey, find the person that's going to be your dungeon master, that's going to be able to inject the story and the life into this that you can live and operate in. And I think that's not always best left to the average player, I guess.
And part of my problem with those type of games is, again, I tend to find myself concerned that not everybody is enjoying themselves. Like, I sort of have a tough time, like, really locking in for whatever reason. In terms of my general, like, reading, I've sort of drifted to nonfiction in general. So I wonder if that's part of it. But I'm always sort of concerned, like, is everybody having fun? And that sort of becomes my overwhelming thing. So, yeah, I think if I was going to enjoy a more like text-based thing, it being solo and being able to sort of read it at my leisure and not worrying about, like, is it appealing to everybody, would be very helpful.
Totally.
So do you think that there is a lot more room for growth in the like narrative storytelling aspect of board games? I mean, Nikki Valens and their work on Artisans and Dragonholt, and as we mentioned, like Eldritch and Mansions of Madness, maybe proves that there is. But I always wonder, like, is this an aspect of board gaming that just isn't there? Like, do you think apps are a way? Do you think having this like third-party narrator that is like maybe built into your smartphone or something is the avenue to take? Like, do you think there is room for growth there? Or
I think it could be if it's done in creative ways. I think the danger of doing that, I think the more you rely on an app, the more you're at risk of just trying to emulate a video game less well than the video game is able to do it. I think there's a lot of people for whom, like, for example, very linear storytelling video games don't work in the same way because they're just like, well, this is done better by movies, for example. And I think that there is something to be said about finding the unique ways that a specific medium does cater to storytelling very well. And I absolutely, unquestionably think that's just something that's going to get better and better over time. Like, this is part of my core philosophy that board games are only getting better. You know, like, you will find, because, you know, everything that we experience that feels novel is built upon a core idea that someone experienced in another game, right? Oh, here's how Gloomhaven did its scenario design. I can do that, but do that slightly better. And then it's iterative. And like, someone will find something that's neat about, say, Nikki Valens's games, and then say, like, oh, here's the way that I do that, but with my own interesting twist, that it does something that I've not done or I've not seen before in a game, or that uses the medium effectively. Yeah, I'm very confident this can come. I don't think it's going to necessarily come from leaning into the app direction, although I do think, like, for example, Dark Tower, like, the way that used the app was interesting and novel in ways that we hadn't experienced with an app game before, and there'll be fun, like, innovations like around that, I'm sure.
And to be clear, like, this has been a popular form of board games, you know, for a long, long time. I mean, going all the way back to Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective back in the early 80s. Like, so this is not like a new fad or anything, but both in how long storytelling games have been part of the board game world and how popular they are. Like, you know, Gloomhaven, Sleeping Gods, just from a couple of years ago, was like a super, super popular game.
Absolutely.
Had a very heavy storytelling part to it.
Totally. I mean, if anything, it's amazing we've not spoken about Sleeping Gods sooner in this episode, because that is another excellent example of doing, like, not even a narrative storytelling, because, like, I think Sleeping Gods' like main innovation is that it's more like an open world story exploration where you are finding mini stories in whatever direction you go. And that is also, again, something that just feels like, again, pretty novel for board games.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of untrekked lands to, like, discover here for sure.
Yeah, I hope so. Again, I've never really had like a narrative game hit for me, but I feel like I could see myself really getting into something if it worked out, but just haven't had it yet. But yeah.
I'm trying to think what would be the one specific thing I would recommend to you, and I don't know what it is. Like, especially in the context of solo, because maybe it is Sleeping Gods, quite honestly. I do think that you might butt up against the reading problem, which is to say that, like, how invested are you in just, like, reading a lot of text on your own? But
yeah, and one of the things that was throwing me off with Sleeping Gods, or making it less appealing, is the way that narrative was done in the other Locket games, like Above and Below and Near and Far, which was like sort of felt very choose your own adventure, like, but very random. It sort of took choose your own adventure and it sort of messed up the game part, I think, at least in the case of Above and Below, where it's like you read a thing depending on where you were, and then you were presented with a choice, but there was no real sort of rhyme or reason to which part of the choice would be better or not, and it sort of affected the game in a negative way, I think. So that sort of had made me wary of other Ryan Lockett games. But I know Sleeping Gods is very well respected and well regarded, so maybe I should give it a shot.
For what it's worth, it is pretty different in that regard, in that, like, I would say, if anything, I think if I have a big criticism of Sleeping Gods, is that the mechanical parts of it are much less interesting than the storytelling parts of it. But they're not like intertwined in the way that I think bothers you with Above and Below, where, you know, choices you make in the story are going to have arbitrary gameplay effects.
Well, maybe we should open this up to the listeners. You can go to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. And I've got to believe there are a lot of people like myself who are, you know, happy with movies and books and stuff like that. But when it comes to board games, the narrative part hasn't really clicked for them very often, and sort of have enjoyed games like Freedom of the Underground Railroad for that kind of thing. If there are people out there like me who have found games that do narrative well, let us know at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, and go to the podcast channel where we talk about that week's episodes. I would love to hear recommendations for sure.
Definitely. I think for me, especially in the vein of the stuff that you were talking about, where it's less paragraphs of text, you know, where you're doing interesting things mechanically that convey those stories. Like, those are the things I would love to hear more about. But I think that's as good a place to end it as any. So yeah, if you have any thoughts on that, we would love to hear them. You can come to our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, which, if you're not familiar with Discord, is sort of a chat platform that you can get on your phone or on your PC. And there are a lot of amazing people in that community if you just want to talk about board games, play some online games, or just hang out and chat. It's a lovely, lovely place. You can go there by going to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Otherwise, you can find us on social media at Facebook, at Twitter, at Instagram. Just search for Board Game Barrage and you'll find us. And that will do it for this week's show. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, as always, to Heart Society for their intro and outro music, What's in Your Mind, Kid? And goodbye.
Goodbye.